Anka Sahin is the Informer's chief political editor and a man who has been consistently vocal around government overreach. In the post-COVID world, we all now know how far governments can indeed overreach. It's now safe to conclude that there is a chasm between those who believe some emergencies do justify government suspending basic rights and those who believe government shouldn't be able to do any such thing under any circumstances has only widened the gap. If we allow governments to use the Constitution for its own agenda during an emergency, what will governments be capable of if we indeed change the Constitution based on division of racial identity? Joining us is Anka Sahin. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Ben. Nice to be here again.
Absolutely. And my first time with you, so thank you.
Exactly.
So voice to Parliament. I mean, you've been very vocal about it. I mean, where do you sit and how do you think it can it be a positive thing for Australia, or is it going to be a negative thing? I mean, it's obviously a very divisive issue at the moment, but where are you sitting on it all?
Look, right from the start, Ben, I've always I've committed myself to keeping an open mind about it and listening to all the arguments for and against out there. What I have noticed from a very early point on in the debate, and some would say that the debate proper hasn't even started yet because we haven't got a date for the referendum and the formal process hasn't yet started. But of course, the discussions around the voice has been happening since the release of the Karma Langton report and the government committing themselves to implementing its recommendations, starting with a voice to Parliament, and then treaty and truth will follow in whichever order. But the interesting thing with the debate has been how one-sided it's been. And when I say one-sided, I don't necessarily mean that the majority of airtime has been taken up by the supporters of the yes vote, although you could probably say that the yes vote has received a lot more exposure simply because of the fact that the government is behind it and has really pushed it on. But it's when I talk about it being one-sided, the types of comments that people who are either sitting on the fence about the proposal or who find themselves in the no camp have received from the supporters of the voice, being told that they're racists or being told that they are people who do not want something better for Indigenous Australia or for Australia as a whole. And I think that's to some extent poisoned the debate and pushed maybe people who were possibly previously on the fence to the no camp. And in fact, one of the recent polls by Ron Morgan found that people who were on the fence were more likely to drift into the no camp than they were to drift into the yes camp. And I think that's telling. And I think that's an indication of where the debate has taken us so far, and we're not even at the start of the formal process yet.
Yeah, no, I mean, we saw what happened during COVID, and I mean, I got upset with COVID because our kids weren't able to go to school, and we had human rights taken away from us, not because of a virus, but because of blind government and bureaucratic incompetence. And the overreach during COVID was huge. And then you have something like the Voice to Parliament, which is a hugely important thing for this country, because the ramifications of it are profound. But one has to wonder what happens if you give the government an opportunity to have change our constitution based on racial divide, and what that will do to us, and then what they could potentially do with it. I mean, I'm, not sitting in the conspiracy theorist camp by any stretch, but to me, I don't think it's about changing the constitution. I think it's about real solutions for real issues for Indigenous people.
That's absolutely right. Look, looking at it from the government's perspective, or from the perspective of those in the yes camp, one argument that they have consistently voiced in favor, and by way of an explanation as to why the constitutional route has been preferred to the legislative route. Why not legislate for it now? See how it is in practice.
Why haven't they done that? Why wouldn't they do that? Why wouldn't they do a legislative change?
Look, as an outsider, there seems to be two reasons for it. One is because the government is keen to leave some sort of legacy, and they see this as an important part of their legacy, that if they're able to push this through by way of a referendum, and we know from past referendums how difficult they are to get up. In Australia, there's only been 8 out of 44 referendums in the past that have been successful in Australia. That's all. And none since the late 70s, right? So that's a long time. The newer generations since then have never seen a successful referendum, and the last referendum we had was the plebiscite for the marriage equality being put to one side was the Republic back in 1999. We know how that one ended up. So going back to the process of why the government was so keen. One reason was that this obsession with legacy, and the other thing was, I guess, a wish from their side, or a determination, if you like, to go along with the recommendations that were in the Uluru Declaration from the Heart. So I guess, and that declaration obviously called for a voice to Parliament. And what form that voice to Parliament would take was detailed in an extensive report to the government, now known as the Carmel-Langton report, that goes into a bit more detail as to what that might look like. Now, one thing I have noticed. So these are the two reasons that proponents of the yes vote, as well as people on the government side who are pushing for this to be done constitutionally as opposed to legislatively, have put forward as arguments why they want to do it that way. But there hasn't been a lot of discussion around what that report actually says, assuming that the government will adopt the majority of the recommendations in that report if the referendum were to get up. There hasn't been a whole lot of discussion as to exactly how this type of thing can function. One I guess criticism that the proposal for the voice has received, because the government has said, we're foreseeing around 20 to 25 members. This will be based in Canberra, and of course people are saying, well, there are hundreds of Aboriginal nations. How are you going to choose 24 people out of hundreds of nations? And then you have our 6 states and 2 territories, and the boundaries of those states and territories do not correspond to the traditional boundaries of the Aboriginal nations. How is that going to work? How is it going to work if you are asking people to vote democratically in a referendum for a voice to Parliament, but yet when the time comes for the voice to be constituted, it's probably not going to be an elected body, but rather an appointed body. And the reasoning for that was explained by way of saying, well, certain Aboriginal nations are much bigger than others. If there were to be an election, or if the members of the voice were to be elected, those nations could be overrepresented, therefore skewing the outcomes. But it still doesn't address the issue of how are you going to achieve some sort of balance between so many different nations out there whose boundaries do not correspond to our state and territory boundaries. So these are all very legitimate questions. The other thing that the report talks about is local and regional voices. So everyone thinks that there's only going to be one voice. There's going to be one national voice, and that's going to have a very small membership. But the Carmel-Langton report talks about multiple regional and then local voices. So effectively, you're going to have all these other voices out there that will also want to be listened to. And then there's the constitutional issue of when you change the constitution to say that there shall be a voice, are you just talking about the voice that's going to be in Canberra, that's the 24 people, 20, 24, whatever, the 24 people sitting in Canberra? Or are you also including within that all the regional and local voices that the Karma-Langton report calls for? And if so, will government, including executive government and parliament and executive government, will they have the obligation to listen to all these local and regional voices as well, or will requests and wishes and comments and feedback, etc., will it filter through the local voice to the regional voice to the national voice and then eventually to parliament? I mean, what kind of what is this process going to look like? I mean, all sorts of discussions are happening, but the real discussion as to, is this even going to work hasn't happened yet, and I'm still waiting for it to start. I'm happy to kick it off.
Well, we've kicked it off, and I think what we've just said is it's a minefield. It really is. And I mean, I hadn't even thought of it in that perspective, because you're right. We talk about being inclusive with our Indigenous heritage and everything, and you're right. It goes past the borders of New South Wales and Northern Territory, and there are literally hundreds of Aboriginal or Indigenous communities to think about, and them having an input into it. So, I mean, that's just one argument in itself. How do you structure this voice to Parliament to be able to take in all of it? I mean, it just, and I think one of the other difficulties is exactly what you're saying. Nobody's talking about it. Like, we don't know what the solution is. When it gets to Parliament, when it gets to Canberra, and we've got your 24 voices, now what? What are we going to do?
Exactly. Now what? And some people on the no camp have expressed concerns that and in fact, this even came from the government, which is possibly more concerning. I think it was the Prime Minister who said it would be a brave government not to listen to the recommendations of the voice. Now, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that every time the voice makes a recommendation, the government will have to listen to it, or there will be some ramifications? Exactly what will those ramifications be? And people in the no camp have said, well, is this a way of inviting the courts to step in and actually compel the government to say to the government of the day, whether it's this Labor government or some other government in the future, because it's now in the Constitution, and if there is some sort of disagreement about what it's supposed to do and what the government's role is in terms of listening to it and heeding its advice and recommendations, will it finally end up in the High Court with the court finally saying, right, this is how this thing in the Constitution that the people have voted to put into the Constitution is to be interpreted, and from this point onwards, this is what a government has to do when the voice comes to the government with its recommendations and advice, and that's a legitimate concern. I have the same concern.
Do you think it will get to that point where some of these things are just going to end up in the High Court, and it'll end up being the decision of the High Court about how governments actually put it together, because they won't have done all of this work that they needed to prior to the referendum, if it gets through?
My personal view is that it's inevitable that at some point it will have to be litigated. Yeah. And the reason for that is there will come a point where, whether it's this government or some other government in the future, where the voice comes up with a recommendation, they say this concerns the Aboriginal community, and our recommendation is that such and such proposed bill should not pass in its current form, and we propose X, Y, and Z, and the government says no, we're going to go ahead and do this the way we wanted to initially, and this will eventually end up, if it's disputed, if it ends up in a dispute and it can't be resolved, it will end up in the courts and probably all the way to the High Court. It's inevitable, whether it happens now or 2 years into the future or 10 years into the future. I think it's inevitable that one day it will happen.
Which I think, yeah, and which is just, and I think it's a sad thing that where if we not necessarily criticize it, if we're asking for more information about it, from a very basic point of view, we are well, it's obvious you're obviously a racist bigot, and it's just not the case, because these kind of issues, we don't want to have our constitution in the High Court, or decisions that were made off the basis of the constitution in the High Court. It's not about us being racist. It's about what's actually the plan. And at the moment, there doesn't, and you've raised the great point, there doesn't actually seem to be much transparency about how we stop it going into court.
Oh, that's right. And the whole point of a referendum is that it's people deciding on the basis of information that's being put forward to them. And if the information that's being put forward to them is insufficient or lacking, or I guess it's misleading or deliberately leading them to conclude one thing as opposed to the other, it might not be a healthy outcome. Because a referendum is not supposed to be something that divides people along party lines, right? If it was, then we would simply have another election with one party going into it saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put this into legislation, and the other one saying we'll never ever do that. And in fact, if the other guys put it in, we'll get rid of it. It's supposed to be people making that decision, but making an informed decision. Otherwise, it's obviously not going to be a healthy outcome. And when people in the yes camp try to paint this as if it's a partisan issue, as if everyone who's a Labour voter, for example, is in favor, and everyone who's a Liberal voter is against, and those people who are sitting on the fence probably are swing voters or something. I think that's a highly simplistic way of presenting the situation, and I think it's misleading as well, because when you look at the people in the no camp and when you look at people who are on the fence, you will see people right across the spectrum in that camp. You will see people who have voted Liberal in the past, who have voted Labour in the past, possibly even Greens, who knows. I don't think the surveys have gone into that level of detail, but people right across the political spectrum, I would say, and certainly Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous Australians.
I mean, I think in Victoria, John Pesutto, leader of the state Liberal Party here, he hasn't made a decision and has been criticised for, I suppose, sitting on the fence for the moment, whereas Dutton's come out and gone, bang, it's no from us. And do you think, and then obviously, Albanese and the Labor Party are very much for it. Do you think as it gets closer, or we find out the final date for the referendum, it will become more political? I mean, Pesutto's sort of trying to stay out of it, but he's not going to be able to. But it does seem to be a political football.
Look, I prefer Pesutto's approach much more so than others. I'm not in favor of if something is important enough to be put to the people in the form of a referendum, parties to take sides so blatantly, I think goes against the whole spirit of a referendum. Because as I said before, then why have a referendum? If you're going to make this into a political football, then just have another election and say to the people, this is what we're going to do, and just do it. And if you want to go to the people and ask them a question, then at least respect their choice without having to compel them into or guilt trip them or direct them into voting one way or another because they may have voted for you in the past. I think that way of leaving people to make their own decision, but obviously, going back to what I said before, it's important to be able to make those decisions based on comprehensive and accurate and a good level of information that's out there. That's very important. That's what made the Republican referendum fail back in 1999, because it was unnecessarily it was politicized for one thing, and it was also the way the question was worded was too loaded, and that obviously didn't sit well even with people who were in favor of the Republic back in 1999.
Just to sort of finish up, I suppose, what level of information, leaving yes, no aside, what level of information or what detail would you want to see come out of you know, the yes camp, I suppose, the yes campaign for the referendum, or for, you know, for the actual referendum? What information would you like to see for it?
I guess having reviewed the Karma Langton report a bit myself, I would want to see whether the government is proposing to implement the majority of what's in that report. Because as I mentioned before, it talks about regional voices, local voices. Exactly how that's going to happen isn't very clear. And if we're going to end up with, you know, tens of voices as opposed to one, you know, if people are asked to vote for a voice to Parliament that's going to sit in Canberra, and I know, putting aside the concerns that some people have voiced with it potentially being an elitist vehicle for the cream of the Aboriginal crowd, leaving that one leaving that aside for a moment, if people are asked to vote for one voice and they end up with tens and tens of voices at local and regional levels, as well as the national voice, I think that's something that people need to know. I need to know. If that's what I'm going to get for my vote, I need to know that. I think that's really important. You know, how exactly it's going to work, and why would the government not release the Solicitor General's earlier advice? And that's something that really hasn't sat well with me either. You know, that they have gone to the Solicitor General, they got advice before they put all of this together, and when they were pushed to release that advice, they actually released brand new advice that had just recently been obtained, which was more in the form of a summary type thing that they have released. And they're saying, oh, well, you know, the earlier advice is confidential, we can't release that. But yet they were quite happy to release that same advice about, you know, Scott Morrison's, you know, the secret ministries and so on. That same advice was released for that. But when it comes to the earlier advice that the Solicitor General gave to the government, and we even know the dates on which that advice was given, we're being told that that's some sort of big secret that cannot be put out. But at the same time, you're happy to go to the people of Australia and ask them to vote on something when you're also hiding this very key advice on how it's supposed to work and the constitutional elements of it from the people. To me, it's not consistent.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's no, there's a lot of questions still to be answered. I mean, we could talk about it for forever, Anka.
We certainly could. And look, I can see us going back and revisiting this as things progress and
absolutely.
The campaign proper kicks
off. And I suppose it, from a point of view, is I think you and I are probably on the same page, that we hope we get more information that gives people the opportunity to make, you know, a non-political decision, a genuine decision of what the right way forward is.
That's right, and I want people to make that decision as freely as possible, without being painted into a corner by this camp or that camp, being called names or being you know, being pigeonholed into you know, certain assumptions and things like that. I think it should be a very open, transparent debate about the merits of it, not the political elements.
Absolutely, Anka, thank you. Fantastic to meet you for the first time and talk to you again soon.
No, it was a pleasure, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you.